Okay, so beyond that, given that this is the landscape now, colleges are still pretty competitive across the board, both the UCs and for private universities and out-of-state universities. What can you do, right? So part of today's topic is really, what kinds of things can you control and help you in the admissions process that can have positive impacts in terms of your chances of getting in. So the first thing I want to talk about today is utilizing early action and early decision to your advantage. Right. So first of all, just to clarify, those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, early action means you apply early, you find out relatively early, in this case, maybe around December or January, but you're not committed to go. It's not binding, so to speak, right? Whereas for early decision typically it operates under the same time frame. You will apply early, which means your application needs to get in usually by November 1st. Right? But you will find out typically by mid to late December whether or not you got in. Okay. Now, the advantage typically for early decision is that you will typically get higher acceptance rates for ED compared to the overall rate and even compared to the early action rate, right? So ED gives across the board the highest increase in terms of the difference between the overall rate and the early decision acceptance rate. Okay. Now, on the downside, it is binding, which means if they accept you, you have to attend. But then again, if you're picking that school as your early decision school, it shouldn't have to be a negative, right? You shouldn't look at it like, oh, I have to go to my dream school, right? So one of the key things that we tell students is that you really do have to do your research, find out what schools you're most interested in, and really decide which school you want to commit to in terms of applying for ED. Okay. One of the key things is that you saw the trend that a lot of these schools have seen their EA/ED acceptance rates decrease, right? But for early action and early decision, these decrease at a less precipitous rate. And in some cases, the ED rate has actually peaked a little bit compared to the previous year. Okay. Now, one of the key other trends dealing with early admissions that we've seen is that more and more schools are accepting a larger percentage of their incoming freshman classes through the early rounds. Among the Ivies, for example, it ranges from Columbia at 43% of their EA or their overall class being accepted in the ED round, up to about 52% for Brown. Okay, so that's kind of like close to half the incoming freshman class is accepted in the early round. And so, of course, it makes a lot of sense for you to try to take advantage of that because, while yes, the number of applications are increasing, if these schools are also increasing the percentage of students accepted, that means there are more spots now being dedicated to early action or early decision. Okay. Now, just as a comparison, now a lot of schools have yet to release their early action or early decision acceptance rates. But as you can see here, for Brown, it's dipped by about 1.5%, Dartmouth by about 1%. But like for some other schools like Harvard didn't really move that much, Yale about 1%, right? So overall, I would say these still represent tremendous opportunities compared to what their overall rates might look like. Okay. Now, of course, you might look at these and you're like 13%, 10%, those are kind of low, right? Wait till you see the overall rates, right? Actually, I kind of already showed you the overall rates. So like Harvard is probably around like 3.5%. So it's still about double. Yale probably pretty close to that, right? Okay. So some things to keep in mind is that if you're comparing this to the overall acceptance rate, even that is sort of misleading because the overall acceptance rate also already factors in the accepted students for EA or ED, right? So I think a more accurate way to compare this, and I'm using data from about a couple of years ago for the class of 2025 because this is more complete. Like we had the entirety of the Ivies except for Princeton. So as you can see, based on this data alone, in that year, the total overall acceptance rate for Harvard was about 3.4%. But if you only looked at the percentage or the acceptance rate of people who applied for regular decision only, it went down to about 2.6%. So if you compare that to their EA or ED rate, you're talking about a difference of 2.8 times, right? So that's pretty substantial, right? Now, this is what I said in terms of like ED having often higher rates. So Harvard, Princeton, and Yale all use early action, whereas Columbia, Penn, Brown, Dartmouth, and Cornell all have early decision. And as you can see, it's actually much more starkly kind of like higher, I guess, in terms of the difference between RD versus ED, right? All the way up to Dartmouth, where you're looking at something like almost 5 times, right? And that's kind of ridiculous if you really look at it, right? So which means strategically for those schools like Brown and Dartmouth, ED would definitely give you a much higher chance relative to the regular decision only. Now, of course, this isn't really as clear-cut as, oh, my chances are tripled or quadrupled. There are some extenuating factors, and I kind of want to maybe talk about that a little bit. So even though these rates might really look very high, and you're probably right to be a little bit cautious about that or skeptical about that, because there are some exceptions, right? So many schools will oftentimes use their early action or early decision applicant pool in order to recruit exceptional students, be it for athletics or maybe some special VIP cases, right? They typically encourage these students to apply early because they really want to try to get them into the college and lock them in, okay? So we take Brown as an example here, right? So every single year, Brown has about 200 recruited athletes and about 100 other special case recruits. These could be like, I don't know, kids of celebrities or maybe world leaders or something, right? So they're always going to be these special cases. So even if you did factor in those students, so if let's say 300 spots are already taken out and you're just talking about the generally unhooked students who are applying, that rate might drop down to, let's say, about like from 14.5% down to 10%. But still, that is still about 3 times their normal RD only rate. Right. So even if you factor in special case recruiting, it is still a substantial difference. It's still significantly higher to apply for early action, early decision. Okay. So, the key takeaway here is that if you make the right decision in terms of which school you're going to attempt to go for EA or ED, it can be a really good boost in terms of your admissions chances. Okay. So, let's get right to the point. Like, should you apply your EA or ED? In most cases, the answer would be yes. Okay. I would suggest here that early action works better if you're already a fairly strong and competitive candidate for the school, right? So especially because the early pools tend to be more competitive. So ideally what you want here is if you're familiar with the terminologies of like, it's a far reach school, or a target school, you probably don't want to necessarily ED to a far reach school, because if it's well above your numbers in terms of the average GPA and test scores that you're going for, then the rest of the applicant pool looks much more exceptional relative to you, right? And if there are fewer applicants, you stick out like a sore thumb, right? You don't look out as competitive. Now, on the flip side, you don't want to sell yourself short either and apply to a school that was in your target range where you could have gotten in regular decision and you could have used that ED to maybe boost your chances for another school, okay? So don't sell yourself short. Don't necessarily be too conservative when you're looking for schools for early decision. So the key is to find that right range where it is a reach. It's a little bit more competitive maybe than your numbers, but you have other things that you want to show the school, like you have, stronger activities and you're really passionate about the school that can maybe help your chances to get in. Okay. So that's kind of like the appropriate range that I would say makes the most sense when you're applying for a school for ED. Okay. Now, if a student in particular struggled during their 11th grade, I would err on being more conservative in deciding your early action or early decision. Because if a student struggled late in their high school career, many colleges will default to deferring them or pushing them back to the regular decision round, because they would like to see whether or not your grades sort of rebound, right, by the first semester of your 12th grade. So it would make sense if, let's say, for example, you knew that you struggled in 11th grade, don't necessarily go for ultra competitive schools for early action. What you can do, though, is you can apply to, here's my next point, having some early safeties or backup schools, right? You can look for schools that you were thinking of applying to anyway, and if they had early action, it makes sense to apply to those schools, because then you can kind of like lock them in. If you can get 1 or 2 schools that you were hoping to apply for early, then you can trim the rest of your list later on, because then you could say like, oh, I already got accepted to Fordham or Santa Clara, and I like those schools more than some other safeties. At that point, you don't even have to submit those 2 or 3 extra safety schools at that point. Okay. All right, next up. So beyond just applying early action or early decision, right? So this is typically the terminology when people say apply early, right? I also want to encourage students to apply early, as in like well before the deadline, even for early action or regular decision. Okay, so I would suggest that it's a good practice for you, for any college that you're applying to send in your application maybe 2 to 4 weeks before the stated deadline. Okay, and there are several key reasons for this, right? Yes, you could theoretically send it in like a good 2 or even 3 months before, but then, you know, one, they're probably not going to be reading it at that time, so you might have submitted it way too early. And 2, you could have used that time to go ahead and strengthen your essays and the rest of the application. So 2 to 4 weeks makes a lot of sense, because this is when admissions people are now just getting back into the offices after having done their visits. So this presents a good opportunity for them to start reading your applications before the flood of everybody else's applications get in there, right? It also gives you a lot of different distinct advantages. One, it sends the signal that you're more passionate about the school, right? So if you've gotten your application there in order, that means that you are not hesitant. You want the school, you're applying to it, right? You're basically showing to them your eagerness to be considered for their school. 2, it also shows that you're very efficient, very organized, that you're not a procrastinator, right? Keep in mind that when admissions people see this, there is a timestamp when they download this, right? It actually sees when, it shows when you submitted the application, but it'll also show when they downloaded the application, okay? And then finally, having been a Harvard interviewer myself, I know for a fact that the interviews are not necessarily sorted by preference, right? The office doesn't necessarily say, oh, we want to prioritize these students and they get first crack at the interview. It's not like a job interview where being offered an interview is a sign that they're more interested in you. I think that's what parents often think. Largely it becomes more of just a logistics issue, right? So if you submit your application earlier, there is a better chance that you can get an interview before, you know, interviewers get fully booked, right? So I often got nagged or, you know, like politely requested by the chair if I could go ahead and have like 2 or 4 extra students in my interview caseload, right? So if you applied later, that becomes harder, right? But if you applied, like I said, a good 2 to 4 weeks early, that could definitely help your chances to be able to secure an interview. And these days, an interview could be that crucial edge in terms of setting you apart from other candidates, especially if, let's say, for example, your numbers aren't your strong suit and you want to be able to show your personality and or put more of a spotlight in terms of your extracurricular activities. The interview is going to be very important for that. And I'll talk more about that in detail later on. I will discuss the interview a little bit more. Okay.